I'll be brave if you're brave. I'll be brave, but only if you're brave. And it could be just you and me. We'll be family. Just wait and see.
Welcome, everyone who is able to join us this evening or this afternoon or this morning, wherever you may be watching from, during our Lung Cancer Living Room. I'm Danielle Hicks, Chief Patient Officer here at GO2 Foundation for Lung Cancer. And for those of you who may not be familiar with this programming, or maybe it's your first time, this is a support and education series that we at GO2 created specifically with patients and caregivers in mind, with the ultimate goal of bringing to you live and in real time educational talks from key opinion leaders in the lung cancer community, and really in a format, in a language that's easy for you to understand. As you guys may know or may have seen, we're going to be talking about living with small cell lung cancer tonight, treatments and advances, and we'll be focusing primarily on extensive stage small cell lung cancer, current treatments and advances being done in research. Tonight, we have with us Dr. Jared Weiss. He is Head and Neck Cancer Section Chief, Lung Cancer Section Chief, and Professor of Medicine at the University of North Carolina, Lineberger Comprehensive Cancer Center. Welcome, Dr. Weiss. We are so thrilled to have you with us tonight. And if you wouldn't mind, before we jump right into the program, and I will do time checks and be mindful of time because we have a lot to cover tonight, but can you tell us a little bit about why you chose lung cancer and specifically small cell lung cancer as a primary area of focus?
I was actually very into the science of immunotherapy long before checkpoint inhibitors were a thing. And at the time that I was into this, the only cancers that was really relevant for was melanoma, a little bit renal cell cancer. And so, because of science interest, I was going to be a melanoma doc. And in fact, I chose my fellowship, moved from Boston to Philadelphia to learn from a particular melanoma mentor. And then, pretty much in my first week of fellowship, I met a lung cancer patient. And it was this very intuitive feeling of, these are my people. This is who I want to serve. This is what I want to spend my life doing. It was just such a strong feeling that I went with it. It's a happy confluence that in the last few years, immunotherapy has become a thing for lung cancer. It's brought my scientific love together with my human clinical love. A lot of that draw for me was that at the time I made this choice, nobody cared about lung cancer. I'm sorry to say it so bluntly, but some of my mentors held an intervention when I made a choice to do this. For me, that was exactly the reason to do it, that someone needed to care about this. Nobody deserves to have lung cancer. Smoke, not smoke, I don't care. Nobody deserves it. And that really wasn't the attitude at the time. Lung cancer was heavily stigmatized between the association between smoking and as well the therapeutic nihilism that lung cancer patients didn't do as well as other cancer patients. And so again, it was an intuitive feeling of, okay, I want to serve these people. And then, I was an uptight liberal New Yorker. Why would I move to North Carolina? Well, it's the tobacco belt, right? So if you want to serve patients affected by tobacco, you go where that demographic is, and that's the southeast of the U.S. You asked why small cell. Small cell is kind of more lung cancer than lung cancer. It's the extreme of that. Badly in need of scientific advances. And so again, it was a very intuitive draw. They're just these are my people.
I love that. And I say the collective we, this community as a whole, are so grateful for you and those like you who have really chosen then and now to step up and make this community matter, whether it's non-small cell, small cells, smoking history, no smoking history, just like you said. It's about time, and we are thrilled to have you here. You mentioned small cell maybe not getting the attention in particular that it deserved, and I know I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, but I know things are happening now, and I can't wait to get in and start talking about that. But up until just a very short time ago, there really had been no advancements in how we treat this type of lung cancer in 40, 50 years. Why do you think that is?
I think there were a number of barriers. For one thing, there's the rarity of the cancer. Small cell is about 15% of lung cancer, so it is the rarest of the major types. But there are other barriers. There's the association with smoking. I love my smoking patients every bit as much as my never smoking patients, but let's be candid. What comes with smoking are smoking associated comorbidities. And so you have sicker patients. It's hard to do clinical trials. As well, the disease is more devastating. And so for years, harder to get patients on trials because it was very often that patients had to start that first cycle of treatment. There's the stigmatization that we talked about. There's the fact that the standard treatments are relatively easy to give. So there was less draw for patients to travel for trials, less draw for practitioners to recommend it to them. And then finally, it's interesting. There's an association between small cell and poor socioeconomic status in the US that doesn't exist as much, for example, in Western Europe. That's not universal. Of course, all of our small cell patients are different, but if you're speaking in the aggregate, that was a barrier to trials. To get on a clinical trial, you need to have the financial resources to travel to a trial center, be that regular airplane trips or even a tank of gas. You need to be able to take off from work. Your loved one needs to be able to take off from work. And then there, frankly, a little bit of indictment of those of us who work in the science that until very recently, we didn't understand that well how small cell worked. It's a much more biologically complex cancer than, for example, EGFR driven non small cell lung cancer, which sort of the opposite end of the spectrum in many ways. But the way I'm referring to now is biologically. In EGFR mutated non small cell, you have one major change that drives the cancer. And so it was a little bit easier to learn how to gum up the works of that one change. Small cell, in contrast, is biologically heterogeneous and complex. And so it was also a scientifically harder problem.
It's interesting. So basically, for all of those years, for various reasons, that patients couldn't participate due to their state of health when they were diagnosed, or what the qualifying criteria were for trials, and or access due to socioeconomic status, we could not accrue these trials. Therefore, the trials couldn't progress. Is basically kind of what you're saying, right?
Yeah, I think that was the barrier to the clinical science. And then it's also, where do drugs come from? They come from advances in scientific understanding. And until very recently, those were quite limited.
So you touched on it a little bit, and you mentioned EGFR, and we know for those folks who are not new to this programming particularly those with non-small cell lung cancer, are very familiar with the word biomarker or familiar with what their own personal biomarker status is, and that's not necessarily the case in small cell lung cancer yet. But other than that, what is the biggest difference between small cell lung cancer and a non-small cell lung cancer?
Well, so the fundamental underlying difference is the cell of origin. Non small cell lung cancer either arises from a glandular cell in the lung, usually cells whose job it is to secrete mucus into the airways, or from squamous cells in the lung. Squamous cells are these tough cube shaped cells that the body puts wherever it needs to protect something. Small cell, in contrast, arises from signaling cells, what doctors call neuroendocrine cells. So it's a different cell that goes bad. And also the way that it goes bad is different. So the fundamental nature of cancer is that it's a disease of mutation. So inside of every cell in the healthy body, in fact, every plant, animal, human, are made up of these microscopic building blocks called cells that have a set of instructions inside of them called DNA. Cancer happens when there are mistakes in the DNA that make the cell forget how to do its job and instead learn how to spread and grow, the nature of cancer. And what kind of cancer is it? The first thing is the type that went bad. The second is what mutations go bad. So in non-small cell, particularly the adenocarcinomas, you'll sometimes have one event that's really, really important in converting that cell over. These are called driver mutations, and you can often gum the works up of them. In contrast, small cell tends to have a more complex mutational landscape. It tends to be a lot of little mutations that add up. Some of them are particularly bad prognosis and don't have drugs. Things like P53 and RB that are classical in small cell help make it a very aggressive cancer and don't yet have drugs that address them.
Let's talk a little bit about how we stage small cell, because it can be done in a couple of different ways, but the more common way would be two. Can you explain to us what those two sort of stages are and what they mean?
Sure. So technically, when I teach my fellows about small cell, because they have to pass their boards, I teach them the TNM system, stage 1 to 4, like most cancers are staged on. I challenge you to find an oncologist from community practice, from academia, anywhere who actually uses that system, because that system is great if what you care about is prognosis, right? If all you care about is saying how likely, what is your life expectancy, that is the best system. However, as an oncologist, I think it's actually much more useful to staging help me address the question, what's the best thing to do? What's the maneuver that is best going to preserve quality of life, that's best going to extend duration of life? And in small cell, it's a really, really simple system. If you can encompass all of the cancer safely in one radiation field, it's limited stage, and everything else is extensive stage. What does that translate to in plainer language? Limited stage is curable, typically with a combination of chemotherapy and radiation. Although in modern practice, sometimes very small ones that we're increasingly finding can be treated surgically. And then extensive stage is everything else, where unfortunately cure is not possible. And our goals of care are extension of duration of life, and perhaps even more importantly, preservation of quality of life, where we're mostly using medicines to control the cancer. And when patients say, "Well, why no radiation? Why no surgery here?" So we do sometimes use them, but why not for the most part? It's kind of like the whack-a-mole game at the arcade. In order for a surgery to provide even a day of survival advantage, you must cut out every last cancer cell. If you can't do that, you harm quality of life by causing a recovery period. You have a real death rate. And critically, for a cancer as aggressive as small cell, you delay the time until you can do something that actually helps, which can cause survival harm. And that's why we use medicines for this, because they get everywhere in the body. They suppress all of the moles, so to speak.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I definitely wanted to jump into some of those treatments and therapies that you touched on there, but you said something that I thought was interesting, and I wanna kinda go back to it for a second, and it was when you were talking about the TNM staging, and you referred to, if you're solely looking at life expectancy. Those are medians, right? Like, people say all the time, "Well, my doctor this, that, or the other said my life expectancy is 6 to 12 months or 12 to 24 months." And can you talk a little bit about how we get those averages and how people are not numbers and they're not statistics, and that some people fall on the before and the after of median?
Yeah, so I really cringe when I hear Dr. Such and Such gave me X amount of time. And it's not, those are not words that I use in the examination room. Let's imagine that there was a median survival. Let's call it X, just to not throw out numbers and have them miscommunicate here. If everyone with a condition lived 10 days shorter than X, or 10 days longer, that would be a narrow distribution. And in that case, saying, you probably have about X amount of time to live would be very meaningful, right? As X approaches, patient could get their affairs in order, say goodbye to the people they love, have understanding. The problem here is that's just not true. With lung cancer in general, including small cell, there's this massive spread from patients who unfortunately die very quickly to patients who live many, many years after therapy. And no doctor knows how long any patient is going to live. And in fact, people have rigorously looked at this. People make research careers out of everything. And people have looked at how good doctors and nurses are at predicting how long cancer patients are going to live. And two interesting things emerged from this. One is we're god awful at it. We have no clue. The other is that there was only one predictor of how good doctors or nurses were, and it was how well you know the patient. But the irony was you were better off knowing the patient less. The better you knew the patient, the less accurate your guess as how long they were going to live. We all work very hard to know our patients, so I hope I'm a bad predictor. Certainly, I would reflect back and say that I have been surprised in both directions many, many, many times. I'm not good at predicting how long people are going to live. Sometimes you have all the reasons in the world for optimism, and it's just not what happens. And sometimes things really look very grim, and then an immunotherapy will kick in, and miraculous things happen, and 2 years later, you see the patient, and it's just this massive joy. You didn't expect to see them a week later, never mind 2 years later. And so I've just tried to stay very hard to stay out of the prediction business, and to instead focus all energy on making it as long as possible and with as good as quality as possible, and leaving the guessing to the fortune tellers.
I love that answer so much, and I'm so grateful for that response because I think more often than we'd like to think, people are given sort of a time frame, and that does nothing for the generation of hope or a willingness to fight the battle. And I think although I don't treat patients, I know quite a few in my 15 plus years of doing this, and I too have been surprised. Um, on both ends, but you are not statistics. So I just wanted to remind.
People have different preferences about how much they want to know, right? So there are patients who want to know those medians. Unfortunately, I'm treating two of my colleagues right now, people with a tremendous knowledge base that they came to their cancer with, cancer experts before diagnosis, and they want to see the papers, they want to go over the medians, and when a patient asks, I do that with all the caveats you and I are talking about. But the problem is that even for those who want that information, there's such a huge spread that even if you have a sophisticated understanding that there is a distribution and what a median is and your personality, even if you accept all of that, it still doesn't tell you anything, because it can't tell you, is your cancer going to be the one that laughs at the treatment? Is your cancer going to be the one that absolutely melts away and stays suppressed a long time? Even a sophisticated understanding of the literature can't tell you if you're going to be lucky or not.
I agree with you, and I think you know none of us know, and physicians or patients, how any one patient may or may not respond. We have an idea based on evidence and science, but sometimes people really surprise us, to your point. So thank you for that. So with that, as I said earlier in the programming, we are going to focus on this extensive stage or later stage treatments and advances. Most patients, as you all know, still unfortunately are being diagnosed at late stage, regardless of what type of lung cancer you have. So this also happens to be where a lot of the new and sort of exciting things are happening. How are we treating these late stage or extensive stage small cell lung cancer patients differently today than we did 5 or 6 years ago? And some of that involves chemotherapy, radiation, immunotherapy, as Dr. Weiss touched on, and of course, research and clinical trials. So I don't know if we want to start with traditionally how it was treated, and then kind of jump into some of the newer approvals and therapies for small cell.
So, if you look back on several decades of clinical trials in small cell, until very recently, we had no improvement in survival. So, it used to be that the first chemo regimen we gave for extensive stage small cell was a regimen called CAV. It's toxic, it's inconvenient for the patient. And we moved from that to carboplatin and etoposide, not because of a survival advantage. I wish there wasn't. Historically, that move happened for a toxicity advantage and a convenience advantage, but there actually was no move in survival. And actually, when I do CME lecturing, a lot of oncologists who grew up with that as the standard regimen are very surprised by that history, but I show them the curves. The first improvement we've had in survival in decades was the addition of immunotherapy to that standard chemotherapy regimen. And so we had two clinical trials that looked at carboetopicide plus placebo, or carboplatin plus etoposide, plus the then experimental agents that are PD-L1 inhibitors, immunotherapy drugs. And I'm going to put aside mechanism unless you ask me about it and stick to plainer English for the moment. But the inspiration of these immunotherapies is not that they improve the median. If we're going to be honest, they really leave a lot to be desired, in the sense that they don't work for most patients. What is inspirational about them is that there is a larger proportion of patients at what we like to call the tail of the curve, which are patients who are alive a long time with their diagnosis. And I think that while I wish everyone were living forever, most of my patients don't come in saying, "Doc, please make me live a week longer. Please make me live a month longer." Patients come in and they want to live to some milestone, to a daughter's wedding, or till their retirement, or whatever it is that matters to them. People care much more about some chance at being alive in a few years than they care about a small improvement at the average. And that's exactly what immunotherapy gives us. Now, I mentioned earlier that I'm a recovering New Yorker. I love pizza. I grew up on pizza. I like when I lecture to the research community. about the unmet needs and how I think we can do better, I make analogy from this advance to pizza. So my wife can tell you that when I have a first slice of pizza, I don't slow down. It actually makes me want the second slice more, right? Tasted good pizza. I'm hungry. I want more of that. And that's kind of what immunotherapy for me is. It's the first slice of pizza. It shows us what's possible. It shows us that if we get it right, it gives us this taste that we can get durable control in patients, perhaps even cures for some previously incurable patients. But it's still, I think, from a human perspective, leaves us unsatisfied, right? We don't want to be curing a small proportion of patients. We want to be curing most patients, if not everyone. And so we have that hint that it's possible. And now the research question is, how do we raise that up? How do we keep raising that up until we hit 100%?
I know back in the early days of immunotherapy, there was, of course, the PD-1, PD-L1 conversations, which are still relevant today. And then there was this sort of idea of tumor mutation burden. And you said at the beginning um, that small cell lung cancer tended to be multiple mutations. Are we looking at tumor mutation burden anymore? Does that play a role here at all in small cell?
So when I treat non-small cell lung cancer, understanding biologic markers, the molecular driver and the PD-L1, empower me tremendously to provide optimal therapy for the patient. At the current moment in time in the clinic, not in research, but in the clinic, there is absolutely no biomarker that helps in any way to do the right thing for small cell. Tumor mutation burden doesn't help. PD-L1 level doesn't help. We don't have it right now.
So is it one of those things that we know it works when it works, we just don't know why? Is that, I mean, that's science, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're starting to get some hints that'll get us there. So there's this really important work conceptually that looks at the transcription subtyping of small cell. I'm not going to nerd out on what that is, but what I do want to share is that this research shows four discrete biologic themes that seem to be driving small cell that look like they're four different cancers. It's very new. We don't yet know how to use this in the clinic. But when I spoke earlier that for years we didn't understand much about the biology and there was less hope of making advances, now we actually do have this major advance in the understanding of the biology. It may not be yet useful to me when I'm in the office with a patient, but these themes are so discrete that it gives me a lot of hope that we will. And in fact, we're starting to get some literature that these four subtypes may be differentially responsive to immunotherapy.
Yeah, you shared that with me when we chatted a couple, 2, 3 weeks ago, and it was news to me. It was something that I had not heard of, and I think it's very exciting, particularly in this space where we don't currently have any biomarkers or good predictors of what the best, maybe first or second or even potentially third line therapies. Are there any biomarkers emerging in the treatment of small cell lung cancer? Is anything happening in that space similar to how it happened in non-small cell?
Well, so there's the transcription subtypes I just mentioned. Oncologists subtype triple negative breast cancer, even though it has equally no meaning for what you do for the patient. It matters for research purposes. The same is true here. The other marker coming out has like the coolest name of any biomarker I've ever heard, Schluffen 11. Could just say that again and again all day. It sounds like it should be a treat for 7-year-olds. But Schleppen 11 seems to predict who benefits from the addition of a class of drugs called PARP inhibitors to chemotherapy. And there are clinical trials prospectively evaluating that idea right now.
That's interesting. I think back to my early days in this space and really trying to kind of wrap my arms around what was happening in both non-small cell and small cell lung cancer. And of course, non-small cell made advances more quickly. And I just think back to a time when we didn't have anything in 2003 when lung cancer first became a really important, part of my life. I think all the EGFR stuff was still in trials, and I look at how far we've come in a fairly short amount of time, and it makes me really excited for the future of small cell lung cancer and how we will continue to evolve, make discoveries, and treat these patients. So some of this, we've touched a little bit on research, merging biomarkers, the four subtypes of small cell, and things that people are starting to kind of think more thoughtfully, I guess, about, for lack of a better way to put it, what is happening right now in small cell lung cancer that makes you really excited for the patients that you treat and other people diagnosed with small cell?
So, there's a lot that's evolving in small cell. If I had to, highlight, there's really one thing that I would highlight that I'm most excited about for coming to the clinic relatively soon. And I have absolutely no involvement in this work. So I'm going to feel free to gush about it as much as I want with no conflict of interest. There's a new drug in a totally new class called BiTEs, called tarlatamab, that I'm really enthusiastic about. So the general class here is something that I would call personalized immunotherapy, which is looking at an individual person's cancer and actioning something on it. So we talked about mutations as changing the function of a cancer cell, right? But they actually also change the way the cancer cell looks. So there are some things presented on what's called the surfacome of the cancer cell, which is the cell surface. And there are some presented in what's called the immunopeptidome. That's going to obviously require a little explanation, but that's the where every cell presents to the immune system things it's making. It's kind of show and tell. Look at me, I'm making this. So that if this is something foreign, like say a viral protein, the immune system can say, hey, we have a problem here. You're a virus infected cell. You're a cancer cell. I got to kill you. And so these foreign elements present an opportunity, something that marks the cancer cells as different from self. This is a lot of what the off-the-shelf immunotherapy is about. And we have a new field of personalized immunotherapy that tries to action something on some element of the cell surface. So what is a BiTE? BiTE stands for bispecific T cell engager. It's a modified antibody. So antibodies are those things floating around in your blood that are those Y-shaped things that are binding to viruses and bacteria and helping your immune system to kill them. This is one genetically engineered so that one side of it binds to this molecule called DLL3 that is commonly shown on small cell lung cancer cells. And the other side is engineered to bind to a T cell, which are the killer cells, kind of the xenophobes of your immune system. They float around killing foreign things, to bring them physically together so that the T cell will then kill the cancer cell. We saw data at ASCO on it, not this past one, but the year before. And we got an update on it this year. The response rate drifted up a little bit, I think from like 20 to, I want to say 23%, something in that range. And we now have a little more durability data. And it looks like it's drifting in the right direction as we see more patients treated at the highest dose level, because this was a phase 1 where the first patients were a lower level and it ratcheted up. I think this is exciting in and of itself because I think this is going to become an approved therapeutic available for standard of care in clinic everywhere. But it's also, to come back to pizza, I think this is that first or second slice of pizza where it's teaching us what's possible, that we can action these specific foreign elements on the small cells to initiate an immune response.
That's absolutely fascinating work, and I know probably way above the heads or the processing mechanisms for most of the folks that will watch this. But with that being said, I think the takeaway is there are exciting things happening in this space. And in a lot of places around this country and the world, I'm sure there's still, the clinical trials are still somewhat stigmatized. People are afraid of getting, their great grandfather's sugar pill. You mentioned a placebo earlier. How do you have those conversations with your patients? And what would you like those folks watching who may be interested but don't know a lot about clinical trials?
Trials aren't right for everyone, and a specific trial might not be a good match for an individual patient. So I view this a little bit like matchmaking. Before I really answer your question, I'll comment that the placebo I mentioned before was standard therapy versus plus placebo versus standard therapy plus new drugs. Nobody was getting less than the standard in that trial. And we have strict ethical standards here. So there are multiple levels of vetting of clinical trials, right? So the first is there adequate scientific promise, right? When you combine the science with a little common sense, is there good reason to be excited that this can actually help people? That's vetted at many levels before a site will consider a trial. So someone proposes an idea. There's many levels of scientific vetting. It's vetted at the FDA to get something called IND, which is the FDA's permission to do a trial that they think it's sufficiently promising, ethical, and appropriate. Of course, you have to convince a funding source, be it a grant or a company, to give money to do this, right? These are fantastically expensive. So before a site even considers it, there have been a lot of vettings. But then, it might be helpful to walk through what happens from there to it being recommended to an individual person. So all across the country, in research groups like ours at UNC, when we have a trials offered to us, we'll sit down and we'll go through the science of each of the trials, and we'll say, is this promising? What is the most promising thing that, in our opinion, and we can be right, we can be wrong, but using our scientific knowledge, that we think is most likely to really be a home run for patients? And then we say, okay, what is known about side effects? Either because people have been treated, or because we can use the mechanism to try to predict how likely it is to have side effects. And then we look at how patient-friendly the trial is beyond efficacy and side effects. And then once the research group says, okay, this is the trial that we think is most scientifically promising to actually help people, acceptable for toxicity relative to efficacy, patient-friendly in terms of the demands on the patients, or the patient-friendliest of what's available to us. And we say, okay, we want to proceed with this. We think this is a good trial for our patients. Then it goes to a level of scientific vetting. At my institution, it's called a PRC committee that vets the scientific promise. If PRC gives their okay to it, then it goes to IRB, which vets the ethics and human subjects protection. And then if IRB accepts it, then and only then can you start up and actually consider it for an individual patient. Then comes the level of vetting, not of, is this a good trial? That's been accomplished, right? If you're an ethical place, you've already opened the trials you think are best in general. But then you have a human being in front of you, and you need to look at the biology of that person's cancer, their physical status, their strengths, their weaknesses, and most importantly, their values, and say, is this the trial I'm going to recommend for this individual person, right? If it's a trial that requires a lot of travel or long times in the chair, someone who can't afford the tank of gas to come in, that may not be the best fit for them. Something that is really cutting edge, totally new, first in man, may be exciting for one person who's a scientist and is exciting about what's cutting edge. For someone who's a little more skittish and wants things a little more established, maybe that's not the right fit for that person. And so there's a vetting process then that very much involves patient and family, of a conversation of not just, is this a good trial, but is this a good fit for the situation you find yourself in? And is this a fit for what you want, for your values? And so it's this many, many, many tiered vetting process of not only is this good, but is this good for you?
Yeah, I love that too. I wish all of our small cell, lung cancer patients could just kind of funnel their way up into North Carolina and come see you, because I think a lot of what you've been
Yeah,
talking about
I'm in
today
North Carolina.
is so very important. I mean, you touched on goals of care and having that conversation. You talked about, making sure your patients understand, whether it's a clinical trial or what you're recommending for a treatment option, that they understand what it is you're suggesting, and you're having this informed sort of decision making conversation. And that does not always happen. I think what you've kind of gone over tonight is sort of the definition of what good looks like and what it should look like. And there's many reasons, that it may or may not in, various sort of places around the country and around the world. But I can't thank you enough.
Yeah, and I think what I would say is demand it, right? So if patients who are able, it's good to get many opinions. You get more trial options, you get different perspectives. But if the right trial is in a place, right, and you're not getting what you need, demand it. Ask questions. The other thing that can be a helpful tool is if you have a good doctor, but that doctor doesn't have the specific trial that you want, bring that doctor information on that trial, right? I routinely will send patients other places who have something promising that I don't have. And then, they'll come back from that place, and either, usually virtually, people don't need to schlep in just to talk, but, over the phone or video, we'll go through that trial, and I'll help them vet it. And doctors all across the country are doing this. It's fine to talk about when it's not done right, and I know you're right. It is sometimes not done right. But actually, what you only need to get it right once to matter, right? So there are many ways to getting it right. An empowered patient is tremendously valuable. So what you're doing here, gosh, I love what you're doing here. It's, I think a lot of doctors hate the internet because people are reading from like Joe in the middle of nowhere. But if you're going to quality information sources, and I would define quality as not only being written by someone who knows what they're talking about, but also having real content, that can be high quality. So, organizations like GO2, or I personally volunteer a lot of time for Cancer Grace, right? Anything that's going to be written by doctors and in plain English with actual real content, as opposed to saying talk to your doctor every 20 seconds, can be very helpful. And again, if, you only need to get it right for one good consult doctor. And that person can help you vet all the other options out there and answer questions. So you're absolutely right. It's not always done right, but it actually matters much more the success that you find. That one doc that you really interact well with, who answers your questions, who helps you vet trials, than all of the more limited interactions there may be out there.
And I think you're so right. And I think, we are huge advocates here at GoTo for folks empowering themselves, becoming educated. And it is a challenge, to your point, not only to find good quality information, but from a patient perspective, that patient first, patient friendly language where you can kind of bring it down to a level that's palatable for these folks to understand. A, they've just been diagnosed with cancer, and B, they didn't go to medical school and they don't understand what a lot of this means. So, helping by providing them access, easy access to information and support, I think is huge. And I struggle with this myself, and I have these conversations with patients when they call and I'm like, well, why did I have to come to you to find out this information about my cancer? Why didn't my physician share it with me? Um, and I always kind of, my retort to that is always, you taught he or she something new today that they will now pass on to the next patient that comes into the door with a similar, scenario or situation. So, you know, don't be mad that you were the educator, be happy for the person who was diagnosed behind you. And I think in today's date, unlike, where you are treating and seeing your patients and doing your research, and particularly some of the more rural, community centers where these general oncologists and people who watch the show regularly are probably sick of hearing me say it. And I'm not saying it's an excuse, but they're responsible for treating any type of cancer that walks in the door. That's blood and solid tumor. And with how quickly things are happening today, I think it's unfair and unrealistic to expect a general oncologist to know everything there is to know about all of those different types of cancer. So how can we facilitate, how can KOLs like you facilitate this sort of transfer of information? How can the patients facilitate it? So I think I see it sort of as all these sort of spokes on this wheel working together to hopefully get the best results we can for people diagnosed with lung cancer.
Yeah, you hit the nail right on the head, right? The advances are coming at a fantastic pace. It is impossible. These are hardworking people. These people care, but it is absolutely impossible unless you're going to treat 2 patients a day and spend the rest of the day reading. It is absolutely impossible to keep up with the rapid advances in every cancer. But here's the thing. Again, it's what you get right that matters, not what happens wrong, right? In order for the right thing to happen for a patient, someone in the room has to know the right answer. It can be the doc, it can be the advanced practitioner, it can be the nurse, it can be the patient, their family, an advocate, right? But as long as the right thing is brought to the front, it doesn't matter how you got there, right? The right thing happens. And so, I think a lot of people assume that those of us that are so involved in advocacy or education, that it's all about comfort and knowledge and empowerment. All those things matter tremendously. But the truth is, it also comes down to the brass tacks of making the right thing happen. And an empowered patient can be a path to making the right thing happen.
I could not agree more. Um, so, sort of take home from all of that is, um, have these conversations with your healthcare providers. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to reach out to GO2 Foundation or other organizations out there that can help you navigate wherever it is you are, in your diagnosis or treatment, up to and including our lung match team, who can help facilitate clinical trial searches. I know that org is very difficult to manage and navigate. NCCN patient-friendly guidelines are less than patient-friendly for a lot of folks out there. So we, like I said, and others are here to help you. And if there's something we can't provide, obviously we have partners and resources to point you in the direction of. So before I am watching the clock, and one thing that I think is really important, it's near and dear to my heart. I'm very passionate about it when talking with people diagnosed with lung cancer, um, as something that they should be having conversations with their doctors with, and that's palliative or supportive care. Quite often, patients hear the word palliative, they automatically think hospice, and they're like, no, 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 I don't want to have any conversations about that. But I want to get your take on palliative care, and then some information you shared with me, in particular about a drug helping to support fatigue, which is a huge sort of side effect for a lot of people going through treatment.
The term palliative care really means, in its broadest sense, anything you do to make someone feel better. And I think in common use, it's anything other than what we do to knock the cancer down that makes people feel better, right? So when you give small cell, tends to be very chemo responsive, right? If you take someone in tremendous pain, struggling to breathe, near needing ventilation, you give them that first cycle of chemo, they may walk out of the hospital feeling 70, 80% of their normal self. So I guess you could call chemo palliative, but as the term is usually used, we mean it as anything other than the chemo, the radiation, the immune therapy, other than the things that knock cancer down. And quality of life is the whole point here, right? So from day one, whether you're going to get the most aggressive treatment we have to offer or nothing to knock the cancer down, aggressive palliative care should start on day one. The pain should be aggressively managed, whether the goal of care is to live as long as possible or to be left alone. Itching, trouble breathing, right? And so this palliative care ideally is done from the very first moment of the first encounter. The term can also imply a specialist. There are people who dedicate their lives solely to the non-cancer reduction elements of palliative care. So the optimization of the pain medicines and other maneuvers to reduce suffering beyond pain, and that's all they do all day long. This can be really powerful, even if your oncologist is good at supportive care measures. It can be very useful, number one, because it brings another perspective of someone who thinks about that all day long, right? And when you think about one thing all day long, you do better than a generalist, right? So I'm very passionate about palliative care, but I have no doubt that the palliative care practitioners I collaborate with are better at it than I am. They think about it all day long, and they're smart, caring people. But number two is another benefit. Even if you have a doc who's thought about it for a long time, who spends a lot of time thinking about it, you only have so much time in the room with that doc, right? And so you and that doc together as a team, and of course the interpersonal dynamics shape the element of the dynamics of that teamwork. We all know that. But as a team, you're going to decide how we're going to spend that time. Are we going to spend that time talking about treatment option A versus B? Are we going to spend that time on how aggressive you want to be? Are we going to write any of your prognosis? So you're going to, gosh, I love sharing pictures of my kids with patients. They, many of them love bringing their pictures of their grandkids, right? There's a triage that you do together as a team. And we all know that there's never enough time. And so if you have someone else who can take the whole length of that visit and dedicate it only to the comfort maneuvers, that's really powerful, because now you're dedicating pure laser-like focus to those comfort maneuvers with an expert in them. And in parallel, you're freeing up time in the room with the oncologist to deal with the things and talk about the things that only they're going to do for you.
I know in conversations I've historically had with patients when they, comment that their doc, suggested palliative care and they basically walked out of the room. I think one of the things that patients or people diagnosed with lung cancer and other cancers, I'm sure, don't understand is exactly what you just said. These are meant to support and make you feel better from any side effects you may be having, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, itching, I think, and there's all these things. There are ways that these specialists can help support you through that. And quite often, I think we have found that people are afraid to have the side effect conversation with their physicians for fear of being taken off the drug.
Right. People are afraid that a shift to palliative care will imply that we're giving up or that we're hastening demise. Hospice and palliative care are not the same thing, right? Hospice is a decision that you're going to focus all energy on comfort. Palliative care is a decision that, in parallel with whatever else you want to do or not do, that comfort is important. And what's really fascinating here is that survival actually improves, not gets harmed with palliative care. So there's a really cool study done by Jennifer Temmel where she randomized patients to palliative care from day one or to palliative care whenever the doc thought it was right to refer, right? Standard practice. And not only were people more comfortable on the palliative care, as common sense would suggest, they lived longer.
Interesting. And I know we did talk a little bit earlier about stigma. I think early in the programming you discussed it, but this is still a very real thing for a lot of folks. And I think you and I both want to make sure um, that our community knows that we are not stigmatizing, we are not judging, nobody is pointing fingers, and that you should not be afraid or feel bad or feel guilty or like this is your fault. That Dr. Weiss and others are here um, to help support and care for you. And I don't really know, and I think a lot of people have tried to figure out the best way to fight this stigma, and we're all coming at it from different angles, which I think is great. But we still aren't the people sort of sitting back in the shadows that are truly feeling um, stigmatized, and how that impacts their care and their journey. I think is really tragic. We are here to empower. The work that we've been doing over the last year and a half or so in small cell has been really fantastic and rewarding. And we began our small cell lung cancer initiative early in 2021 with the goal really of educating, supporting, and engaging the small cell lung cancer community, not only for improved outcomes and quality of life, but to really generate a community, an empowered community around this type of lung cancer. So if you're watching and you have not reached out to us for information on what it is we have to provide from a support and education standpoint as it pertains to small cell, please consider doing so. My colleague Amy Camp Schroeder oversees this program. She is a lovely, fantastic woman who's very passionate about the work that is being done in small cell, and in particularly the people who are living with it. So you've seen our helpline number flash on the screen. You know, off and on throughout tonight's programming, and that can be your entrance in, and we're happy to get you whatever it is you might need. I want to give a huge, huge, huge thank you to Dr. Weiss for coming out and talking to us this evening. I know it is late out there on the East Coast, so we really appreciate your time. Of course, to all of our supporters, Amgen, AstraZeneca, Boehringer Ingelheim, Bristol Myers Squibb, Daiichi Sankyo, Eisai, Foundation Medicine, Genentech, Janssen Oncology, Jazz Pharmaceuticals, Merck, Mirati Therapeutics, Novartis, Regeneron, Sanofi, and Takeda. Thank you so much for your never-ending support year after year for this much needed and important programming. Until next time, we'll see you guys soon.
Oh, I'll be brave if you're brave. I'll be brave, but only if you're brave. And it could be just you and me. We'll be family. Just wait and see.